This is session 2 of Clearblade's ClearLab series. This is a series of 30-minute seminars we're putting together to help developers who wish to build IoT solutions using the Clearblade platform. Be aware that this video is being recorded after the actual session took place. If you were at that session, you would have received an email with an invitation, and in that email, you would have had links to completed copies of code that were built during the session. Be aware that some of that code did not follow certain best practices we recommend. So rather than using the links in that email, I encourage you to look for the same files or versions of those files attached to this video if you don't wish to follow everything that I type and just want to use the completed code solutions. My name is Akash Sharma. I work for Clearblade as an IoT solutions engineer, and Clearblade is a company focused on helping our customers build IoT solutions. Let's talk about the project we're going to discuss together. Then we'll go through the development process. And this is a video, so there's not going to be any questions and answers, obviously. So last session, if you followed us or if you followed the instructions in the video for the first session, then you would have built a system that did something very simple. It acquired one temperature and displayed that one temperature. Eventually, that temperature would be something important for a business asset, and we would read that temperature from a sensor, a thermocouple, RTD, something like that. For the moment, as a placeholder, we decided to use a temperature that's published by the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service has an API, which is several HTTP endpoints to which you can send requests, and we get responses back. One of those endpoints, when you send a request, it sends back a response, which is several hours of temperature forecast data for a certain region. We took the array of temperatures that were provided and picked out one and used that as our placeholder temperature last week. Today, we're going to modify that system to store the entire forecast, times and temperatures, and to display the entire forecast. To save the data, we're going to need to use what's called a collection, which is essentially a table in a database. And to display the data, we're going to use a new widget called a scatter plot. A widget is a user interface element that sits in a portal, and the portal is the user interface. Also, last week, we did everything on our portal as an anonymous guest. Today, we're going to do everything on our portal as an authenticated user. That means we're going to have to register a user with an email address and a password. And when we access the portal, we're going to log in as that user. So you'll see how that's done. And we're going to modify the original code service from session 1 so that it not only acquires the data from the endpoint, but also saves it to a collection. So we're going to have a modified version of that code service, have it write to our collection, and then display the data in a new widget. So with that said, let's look at the Weather Service API, just to really quickly remember what we did. So if you go and search for National Weather Service API, it'll take you to this web page, and this is the endpoint that we used. We used an office code LWX, which is I believe the National Weather Service headquarters location in Baltimore, Washington. And we punched in some XY coordinates that sort of correspond to longitude and latitude. And we got a big response, and buried in this response, what we really care about is an array of values. And that array consists of valid time value, valid time value, valid time value, and the values are degrees centigrade. The valid times are timestamps with something concatenated on the end that's called a duration. We're going to have to chop that off in our code. And the valid time key name is in camel case with a capital T. We're going to modify that and make it all lowercase. And we'll do all that as we build our code. Now let's go ahead and log into the platform. So I want you to open a browser tab and go to platform.clearblade.com. You should have registered. So if you have not, do register. You don't need a registration key. You just need to provide all your information and then log in. And when you log in, you should arrive at a page like this. Now, if you follow the instructions from session 1, then you have a system here already. If you did not to worry, attached to this video, you should have a completed copy of the system from session 1. I'm going to use that. I'm going to have a zip file of that system. Then I'm going to click on Add, pick File, click down here, browse to wherever I have my zip file, and that is going to basically recreate the system we had from session 1. Now let's go through the preliminaries. We need a user. So I'm going to have us go to users here and add a user. The user should have an email address. So here's my email address. So as you can see right now, it doesn't actually have to be a real email address, but it does have to follow the format something at something dot something. And then they have a password, and if you forget the password, you can always come back here and change the password. Since you're a developer, you have access to all that, but hopefully you don't forget the password. Click Create. Now you'll notice that users and anything that essentially connects to our system from the outside is assigned one or more roles. If you click over here, you'll see we have 3 roles we provide out of the box: authenticated, anonymous, and administrator. You can create your own roles. Go ahead and leave authenticated and click update roles. Now real quick, what is a role? A role is a group of permissions that allows the holder of that role to do certain things with certain components in our system. For example, we could say authenticated is allowed to run certain code services, but not others. Or we could say administrator can only write to certain collections, but not others. Or maybe authenticated can write to one collection, but only read another collection, and so on and so forth. It's very much up to the developer what permissions go with what roles. You will see we're going to assign some permissions to the authenticated role as we continue. Next preliminary that we need to do, create our collection. So I want you to go to collections, add collection, do call it this same name, device _1 temperatures. As I said, eventually these temperatures are going to be from some real business asset of ours, and these National Weather Service temperatures are just really a placeholder until we get to that point. Go ahead and create. Here come the roles, the permissions. So we're asked what permissions go with each role. You could say authenticated is only allowed to read the collection, but administrator can also create, update, and delete rows in the collection, for example. But let's just let authenticated do all of it. Go ahead and add permissions. Notice by default you have one column. It's item ID. It's a UUID, which is a randomly generated large set of characters that uniquely identifies a row. We need 2 more columns. Click on Edit Columns. The first column is going to be called Valid Time, and that's to match the first item in our each element in this array, and it's going to be of type timestamp, add, and the next one is going to be called value, and it's going to be of value or of data type float. Add that column. Click on Done. So our collection schema is done. Now we need to modify existing code to write to this collection. So go to code and notice we have the original code service we wrote from the first session, get temperature, go in there. We're going to copy this, but before you copy it, I want you to click on this gear icon, edit permissions, and you see that until now, anonymous was allowed to run this. We're going to change that. From now on, authenticated entities can run it, and that's it. Click Update Permissions. Copy all this code, Control A, Control C. We'll do that. Go back to code, add code, microservice, name the new microservice, get temperatures, plural. Do use this name just to stay consistent with the copy of the code you have. Create. Again, who's allowed to run this? Authenticated is. Add permissions. Now this next part's very important. What libraries does this code service use? Well, it's going to make an HTTP request to that endpoint. So it needs the HTTP library. But click in here and also add the Clearblade library. In addition to the functionality to write to the collection, this Clearblade library has lots of functions that you're going to need as you continue developing with our platform. So go ahead and click Done. Now we're going to override this boilerplate code with what we copied. So Control A, Control V. And before you edit anything else, make sure that the service name matches the name of the main function. So you need an S here. Now you can save and test, and you'll see what the original code service did, which is basically pull out the one temperature that we displayed and used as our placeholder. And it is right here. It's element number 1, and you'll see why it's element number 1 in the array in just a second. It all comes back to this code right here. So real quick recap. This code, we created a request object that would send HTTP requests. Then we had that object send a GET request using some options. And in the options was the exact endpoint to which the request went. And then we have a callback. And the callback is a function that gets called when the GET does its work. So when it's completed its work, it calls this request callback. So that's where we exited the code. So these RESP calls, the RESP object and the rec object are objects that get passed into this code service when we invoke it with the save and test. And here we're exiting the code service either if there's an error with this method called resp.error or resp.success if everything goes well. So this is where we exited the code. We're not going to exit the code anymore. What we're going to do instead is, if this is successful, we're going to write the data that we get to an array, a variable actually. So I'd like you to create the variable. You could actually create it in here, but I think either way will work. I'm going to call it temperature array. It's going to be an array or a list. And in here, rather than exiting, make it so that you set temperature array to the contents that you get from here. Now, the thing is, we're not going to pull out the value item and one element. We're going to take the entire array of values and pass that to this temperature array. Now, our resp.success, let's just keep it there. But this time we will pass out the temperature array so we could see that this actually works. Great, I have the entire array. Now I'm going to do my massaging where I chop off this part and I make this lowercase. Don't have to worry too much about that. Just know that it needs to be done. So I'm going to do it a certain way. I'm going to create a modified version of that array. And I'm going to create a map from the original. I'm going to pass element by element each element from the original array and have this mapping function return a version of it. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining why I did this. It's basically chopping off the / duration, and then the value is time val.value. Now, as I exit, I'll actually show the modified temperature array. And there it is. Valid time is lowercase. I've chopped off the duration. Now we're ready to write this data to the collection. Let's just quickly look and make sure that the collection is empty. Sure enough, it is. So we're ready to write the data to the collection. To do so, we're going to use an object that's available through this Clearblade library called the Clearblade Object. You're going to get very familiar with this object. Before you use any other method of this object, you need to invoke a method called the Init method. So I'm going to put that early on here. Clearblade.init request rec. So I need to pass in one parameter, which is a JSON object with item name request and the value being the same rec object that I passed into the main function when I invoked this in the first place. This is something you're going to just always do. Every time you use the Clearblade object, which is probably something you're always going to do when you use the Clearblade library, you're always going to have this init early on in your code. Now, once I have performed my init, then in here, I can write to the collection. To write to the collection, I'm going to start off by creating a new variable that I call tempCall, temperature collection. Just like, I think of that as like a handle that lets me write. I'm going to create that by calling the Clearblade object and then calling a method called the collection method. I think of this as a constructor. And I need to pass it one parameter, which is a JSON object with collection name as the item name. And the value is device1 temperatures. Now, once I have that, I can use that handle to write. Now, you notice that there was nothing in the collection, so I need to create everything. So I'm going to call temperature collection, and then I'm going to pass in one or more items and a callback. Now, here I'm going to pass in the entire mod temp array, but I could pass in just one item, which is a JSON object containing the two items that go into one row, valid time value. But here I'm going to pass in an entire array of valid time and value. Now, the next thing I need is a callback. The callback is a function that gets called when, oh, sorry, I should have said create here. When this create method has been called, and the callback is going to be called with an error and a data object, or parameters, I should say, such that if there's an error, there's a lot we can do. I'm just going to do something very simple. I'm going to have us exit our code with resp.error, and I'm just going to say failed to write to collection. If you look at the completed copy of this code, you'll see that I actually tack on a lot of useful information that might tell you why we failed to write to the collection. But just for now, I'll just do this. Go back and take a look at the other the solution to see what more we can do. And if there was not an error, then we can write, maybe we can exit this code. That means we actually succeeded. And I'm going to take this here and move it into that else block. But instead of displaying all this stuff, I'll just say succeeded in writing to collection. So with this, we should be able to write to the collection and exit with a success. Now let's just check again that the collection is empty. It is. And now let's run our code. Save and test. I see a succeeded. Now let's go and look at the collection. And sure enough, there's data, timestamp data, and the temperature data. Perfect. So what we want to do now is to display this in our portal. You go to portals. You remember we built a portal in session 1. Before you go and change it, I want you to click on the gear icon at the right, click edit permissions, and change who can do what with this portal. You might allow an anonymous entity to read your portal. That makes sense. You often go to websites and you don't have to log in to see, what's public. But it's very unlikely you will let anonymous entities update your portal. For now, let's just let anonymous do nothing, and authenticated can do everything, update permissions. and go ahead and click to go into your portal. You do have to log in as that new user, as we expected. Log in. And when you log in, you see that you have the widget from last time. You're going to add a new widget, and you do it by clicking in Quick Add. There's actually a couple of ways you could do this. Click there, scroll down, and find the scatter plot. Click. When you drop that, you'll see that there's already data showing up. Where is this coming from? If you look on the left, under data parsers, this is actually a piece of code that's populating that data. That piece of code is calculating the data, and that means that it's not starting with some original data source. It's just purely generating the data. Let's look at the piece of code. Edit. Here it is. Now in this code, if you look, you'll find that the humidity, wind, rainfall, all that doesn't really matter. All that is really being used is the temperature. So if you change this temperature, watch what happens to this dot. I'm going to change that to 41, let's say, and apply control. You see that changed, everything kind of rescaled. So this is simulated data. That's not what we want. We want real data going to this widget. To get the real data, click on Home, go to Data Sources, and Add. Your data source is going to be the collection that we just created. And the name of the collection, you do need to type it in here. And then you click away. Before you click apply, go look at the data tab, and you see that the data is actually there. So we got this right. Now go back to settings and click apply. And now mouse over your scatterplot widget, go to the wrench icon, click on data parsers, and this time change the data source. So click where it says calculate it and pick the preferred data source, which is the new data source we just added. Don't worry about the fact that the x-axis says invalid date and the y-axis doesn't show anything. We're going to fix that. Down here, click on y-axis and notice that the widget is looking for items with the key temperature, but that our data doesn't have the key temperature. It has the key value. So now you see values show up. You can still have a label. I'm going to call this label temp. That shows up right there. And for x-axis, your key is not timestamp. It is valid time. And for label, I might just call it time. So now I see time and temperature as I expected. We're almost there. There's one more thing I need to do, and that is I got to make sure that this data is sorted by timestamp. It looks like it is, but there's no guarantee of that until you ensure it right here. So in the code that was provided to you was a completed copy of this parser, and in there is a sort function. I want you to copy that entire sort function, paste it here, apply control, save by clicking on this red floppy. And now when you go to preview, you see the completed widget with the data that you pulled into your collection. And that is the goal of today's session. One thing I'll go back to and just kind of recap. There's a lot of additional improvements we can make to what we built. If I go back to the code, go to get temperatures. One thing I haven't done here is where I did the JSON parse, where I basically took the data coming from the endpoint and I assumed it was a JSON object. It may not be. And so this JSON parse might fail if the endpoint was buggy. So what I really should have done is put a try catch block around this code. So you try essentially everything, and if there's an error, the catch block executes, and then you probably exit with a resp.error displaying what the exception or error was. And as I said, there's probably additional information I could add when I exited here to say exactly what caused the failure. And that can be done. You can look at the completed copy of this code and you'll see how that's done. Well, I very much appreciate everyone's interest in this information. I believe that the fastest way to build IoT solutions that I have come across is using the Clearblade platform. So I encourage you to give it a try. And if you have any questions, contact us. Here's our website. ipm.clearblade.com is a site where we publish modules, which are essentially completed systems that you can install and use as the starting points for your own systems. There's a lot of functionality there. Contact us if you'd like a 30-minute demo, either of our platform in general, or we have a system pre-built out of the box that allows you to easily monitor assets. We call it our asset monitoring or asset tracking system. It will allow you to have your assets publish all sorts of attributes, including location data. You can track them using maps, and you can configure alerts so that if certain attributes go beyond certain limits, you can execute certain rules and know what's going on. So if you want a demo of any of that, please give us a call. And I'm Akash Sharma with Clearblade, and I appreciate you guys watching. And do join us for the next one.